The smell of fried chicken and beer filled the air at Murphy's Roadhouse as Lucy checked her phone for the third time in 10 minutes. The babysitter had texted saying little Annie was asking for mommy, and it was already past 9 o'clock on a school night. She looked across the table at her husband, Richard, who was laughing loudly with his business friends, completely lost in their conversation about some new construction project. Lucy had been married to Richard for 8 years now, and she knew better than to interrupt when he was in his element. He was a successful contractor in their small Montana town, the kind of man who commanded respect wherever he went. At least that's what everyone thought. They saw the expensive suits, the new truck every 2 years, and the big house on Maple Street. They didn't see what happened behind closed doors when things didn't go Richard's way. The Roadhouse was packed tonight, which was unusual for a Tuesday. Word had gotten around that Murphy was celebrating his 20th year in business, so half the town had shown up for the free appetizers and live music. Lucy recognized most of the faces: the bank manager from down the street, her neighbor Mrs. Peterson with her husband, and several families from Annie's school. She tried to catch Richard's eye again, but he was deep in conversation with Tom Bradley, the mayor's son. They were discussing some big hotel project that would supposedly bring tourists to their little town. Richard's voice was getting louder with each beer, and Lucy could see the familiar signs. His face was getting red, his gestures more dramatic, and that edge was creeping into his voice. "Honey," Lucy said quietly, leaning toward him during a brief pause in the conversation, "maybe we should think about heading home soon. Annie's been asking for us, and tomorrow's a school day." Richard turned to look at her, and for a moment his expression was pleasant enough. "Just give me a few more minutes, sweetheart. Tom here was just telling me about the investors coming in from Denver next week." Lucy nodded and settled back in her chair, trying to ignore the growing knot in her stomach. She knew that tone. It sounded reasonable to everyone else, but she could hear the warning underneath. She'd learned to read those warnings over the years, the way you might learn to read storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The live band finished their set and the Roadhouse got quieter, making conversations easier to follow. Lucy found herself listening to a group of women at the next table talking about their book club, wishing desperately that she could join something like that. But Richard didn't like her going out without him, said it gave people the wrong idea about their marriage. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Lucy's phone buzzed again. The babysitter was asking when they'd be home, mentioning that Annie had woken up asking for her mommy. Lucy's heart tugged. Annie was only 6 and had been having bad dreams lately. All she wanted was to tuck her daughter into bed and maybe read her a story. She waited for another lull in the men's conversation and tried again. "Richard, I really think we should go. Annie's having trouble sleeping and Mrs. Garcia needs to get home too." This time Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. To everyone else, he probably looked like a patient husband dealing with an overly worried wife. But Lucy saw the flash in his eyes, the way his grip tightened on his beer bottle. "Lucy, darling," he said, his voice carrying that false sweetness that made her blood run cold. "Can't you see we're in the middle of important business here? This hotel project could change everything for our family." Tom Bradley shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension even if he didn't understand it. "Hey, Richard, we can always continue this conversation tomorrow. I should probably get home to my wife too." But Richard wasn't ready to let it go. The alcohol had loosened his tongue and shortened his temper. No, Tom. My wife just needs to learn that sometimes business comes first. Isn't that right, Lucy?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Lucy felt every eye at their table turned toward her. She could agree, smile prettily, and endure another hour of this. Or she could stand her ground for once, the way she'd been wanting to do for months now. "Richard, our daughter needs us," she said quietly but firmly. "The business will still be there tomorrow." The change in Richard's expression was immediate and terrifying. The fake smile disappeared, replaced by something cold and angry. Lucy had seen that look before, usually right before things got very bad at home. But they weren't at home now. They were surrounded by their neighbors, their friends, people who thought Richard was a pillar of the community. "Did you just tell me what to do?" Richard's voice was low and dangerous. "In front of my business associates?" Lucy's heart started racing. She could feel the attention of nearby tables shifting toward them, conversations dying as people sensed the electricity in the air. This wasn't how Richard usually acted in public. At home, yes, but never where people could see. I just think, Lucy started to say, but Richard cut her off. You just think? He laughed, but there was no humor in it. You don't get paid to think, Lucy. You get taken care of because you're my wife. And wives support their husbands, they don't embarrass them in public. The roadhouse was getting quieter now, more people tuning into the drama unfolding at their table. Lucy could feel her face burning with embarrassment, but also with something else. Anger. 8 years of swallowing her words, of being treated like a child, of pretending everything was fine while walking on eggshells in her own home. I'm not trying to embarrass you, she said, her voice stronger than she felt. I'm trying to be a good mother to our daughter. That's when Richard's face went from red to purple. He leaned forward, his voice a harsh whisper that somehow carried in the quiet room. Don't you dare question my priorities when it comes to providing for this family. Everything I do is for you and Annie. Then come home with me, Lucy said simply. Come home and help me put our daughter to bed. For a moment, Richard just stared at her. Lucy could see him weighing his options, calculating whether it was worth making a scene. But the alcohol had made that calculation harder, and his pride was already wounded by what he saw as public defiance. Fine, he said, standing up abruptly. If you want to act like a child, I'll treat you like one. Before Lucy could process what was happening, Richard's hand came down hard across her left cheek. The slap echoed through the suddenly silent roadhouse like a gunshot. Lucy's head snapped to the side, her face exploding with pain and shock. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the jukebox seemed to pause between songs. Lucy sat frozen, her hand slowly rising to touch her burning cheek, unable to believe what had just happened. Richard had never hit her in public before. At home, yes, when he'd had too much to drink or when work stressed him out. But never where people could see. She could feel every pair of eyes in the roadhouse staring at her. The shame was overwhelming, hot and suffocating. These were her neighbors, the parents of Annie's classmates, people she saw at the grocery store and the post office. And now they'd all seen her husband strike her like she was nothing. Tom Bradley and the other men at their table sat frozen, clearly unsure what to do. Mrs. Peterson had her hand over her mouth in shock. The bartender had stopped wiping glasses and was staring with his mouth open. Richard seemed to realize what he'd done, but instead of apologizing, he doubled down. Maybe now you'll think twice before disrespecting me in public, he said loudly, as if trying to justify his actions to the room. Lucy felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of everyone. She started to stand, thinking she could just walk out and pretend this had never happened, when she heard a chair scrape against the wooden floor behind her. That's enough. The voice was quiet, but carried an authority that made everyone in the roadhouse turn to look. Lucy turned too, through her tears and humiliation, to see a tall man in a cowboy hat standing near the bar. He wasn't local. Lucy would have recognized him if he was. He looked like he'd just come in from working outside, his jeans dusty and his boots worn. But there was something in his posture, in the set of his shoulders, that commanded attention. Richard turned toward the stranger, his face still flushed with anger and alcohol. Excuse me? Do we know each other? The cowboy took a step closer, his movement deliberate and calm. No, sir, we don't. But I know wrong when I see it, and hitting a woman is about as wrong as it gets. A murmur went through the crowd. Lucy could hardly believe what she was hearing. This stranger, this man who didn't even know her, was standing up for her when her own neighbors had just sat there in shocked silence. Richard laughed, but it sounded forced and nervous. Listen, cowboy, this is between me and my wife. Why don't you just mind your own business and finish your drink? The stranger's expression didn't change. He looked calm, almost relaxed, but Lucy could sense the steel underneath. Can't do that, sir. See, I was raised to believe that a real man protects women. He doesn't hurt them. And I'd say what happened here tonight concerns everyone in this room. Lucy looked around and saw heads nodding in agreement. The shame was still there, burning in her chest, but something else was growing alongside it. Hope, maybe. Or just the simple relief of not being completely alone. Richard seemed to sense the shift in the room's mood. His support was evaporating, his image as the successful, respectable. Cole had been having a quiet drink after one of the longest days he'd had in months. The ranch work was honest but brutal, and his back was reminding him that he wasn't 25 anymore. All he'd wanted was a cold beer, and maybe some of Murphy's famous chili before heading back to the small room he was renting above the feed store. He'd driven cattle for most of his adult life, moving from ranch to ranch across 3 states, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. It was a lonely life, but it was simple. No complications, no drama, just him and the work and the endless sky above. But then he'd heard that sound. The sharp crack of skin against skin that cut through all the noise and conversation like a knife. Cole had heard that sound before too many times, and it always brought him right back to being 10 years old, watching his father take his anger out on his mother while Cole hid behind the couch, too small and scared to do anything about it. He'd promised himself that night, as his mother held ice to her swollen face and told him everything was fine, that he'd never let anyone hurt a woman if he could help it, not ever again. Now here he was, 38 years old, watching some well-dressed businessman in an expensive suit tower over a small woman who was holding her cheek like it was broken. The woman looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor, and every person in that roadhouse was just sitting there staring, like they were watching a movie instead of a real person getting hurt. Cole set his beer down and stood up. He wasn't particularly big, not compared to some of the ranch hands he'd worked with over the years, but he'd learned early that size wasn't everything. Confidence was what mattered, knowing you were right and being willing to back that up with action. "That's enough," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. The businessman turned toward him, and Cole got his first good look at the man's face. Red and sweaty, eyes slightly unfocused from too much alcohol, but with an arrogance that probably came from years of getting his way through money and intimidation. Cole had met plenty of men like this over the years. They thought their bank account made them untouchable. "Excuse me, do we know each other?" the man asked, his voice dripping with condescension. Cole took a step closer, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. He'd learned that lesson from working with spooked horses. Quick movements made situations worse. Calm confidence usually diffused them. "No, sir, we don't. But I know wrong when I see it. And hitting a woman is about as wrong as it gets." A murmur went through the crowd, and Cole could feel the energy in the room shifting. People were starting to take sides, and he got the feeling this businessman wasn't as popular as he thought he was. The man laughed, but it was the kind of laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Listen, cowboy, this is between me and my wife. Why don't you just mind your own business and finish your drink?" Cole studied the man's face for a moment. He'd dealt with bullies his whole life, from the playground to the rodeo circuit to ranch foremen who thought they could push people around because they had a little authority. They all had the same look in their eyes when someone finally stood up to them. Surprise, then anger, then calculation as they tried to figure out how to regain control. "Can't do that, sir," Cole said quietly. "See, I was raised to believe that a real man protects women, he doesn't hurt them. And I'd say what happened here tonight concerns everyone in this room." He gestured slightly toward the crowd and saw several people nodding in agreement. An older woman at a nearby table was looking at the businessman with pure disgust. A young father had his arm protectively around his wife, as if just watching this scene had reminded him what was important. The businessman's face was getting redder now, and Cole could see him starting to lose control. Men like this hated being challenged in public, especially by someone they considered beneath them. A dusty cowboy questioning a successful businessman in front of the whole town? That was probably more humiliation than this man's ego could handle. "You don't know what you're talking about," the businessman said, his voice rising. "You don't know our situation." Cole kept his voice level and calm. "I know enough. I know a man who'd hit his wife in public probably does worse at home. And I know that's not right no matter what the situation is." That hit home. Cole saw the woman's face crumple slightly, saw the truth of his words reflected in her eyes. How many times had this happened before, behind closed doors where no one could see? How many mornings had she covered bruises with makeup and told herself it would get better? The businessman seemed to realize that he was losing the room. People were looking at him differently now, seeing past the expensive clothes and the community reputation to the ugly truth underneath. Cole had pulled back the curtain, and what everyone was seeing wasn't pretty. "Now look here," the businessman started, pointing a finger at Cole. "I don't know who you think you are, riding into town and telling people how to live their lives. I'm nobody special," Cole said honestly. "Just a man who believes women deserve better than getting hit for speaking their minds." Behind the businessman, Cole could see the woman watching this exchange with something that looked like wonder in her eyes. When was the last time someone had stood up for her? When was the last time someone had treated her like she mattered? The businessman took a step toward Cole. trying to use his height advantage to intimidate. Up close, Cole could smell the alcohol on his breath, see the sweat beading on his forehead. This was a man who was used to getting his way through bluster and threats. But he was finding out that didn't work on everyone. You need to back off. Cowboy, the businessman said, jabbing his finger toward Cole's chest, before you bite off more than you can chew. Cole didn't move, didn't even blink. I don't back off from bullies, sir. Never have, never will. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. Would this escalate into a full fight? Would the businessman back down? Would someone call the sheriff? Cole could see the businessman's internal struggle playing out on his face. His pride was telling him to escalate, to prove he couldn't be pushed around by some nobody cowboy. But his survival instincts were probably telling him that this stranger might not be as easy to intimidate as his wife. Richard, maybe we should just go home, the woman said quietly from behind her husband. So his name was Richard. Cole filed that information away, along with the note that the woman was trying to defuse the situation, probably out of habit. How many times had she tried to calm her husband down, to prevent his anger from exploding? But Richard wasn't ready to back down yet. His reputation was on the line, his image as the successful, respected businessman who commanded authority wherever he went. Being challenged by a cowboy in front of half the town was exactly the kind of humiliation his ego couldn't tolerate. Don't tell me what to do, Richard snapped at his wife without turning around. I'm handling this. That was the wrong thing to say. Cole saw several more people in the crowd shake their heads in disgust. Whatever sympathy Richard might have had was evaporating fast. He was revealing himself to be exactly what Cole had suspected, a man who thought he could control everyone around him through fear and intimidation. Seems to me your wife's got the right idea, Cole said calmly. Why don't you listen to her? Because I don't take advice from drifters, Richard shot back. You don't know anything about this town or the people in it. You'll be gone next week, but I have to live here. I have a business to run, a reputation to maintain. Cole almost smiled at that. A reputation to maintain? After what had just happened, after everyone in the roadhouse had seen him strike his wife in public, what kind of reputation did Richard think he had left? Your reputation's your own doing, sir, Cole said quietly. And from where I'm standing, it's not looking too good right now. That hit home harder than Cole had expected. Richard's face went from red to purple, and Cole could see his hands clenching into fists. This was the moment when things would either calm down or explode completely. Behind Richard, Cole could see the woman watching with wide eyes. She looked terrified, but not of Cole. She was afraid of what her husband might do next, afraid of how much worse this could get for her once they got home and away from witnesses. That fear in her eyes made up Cole's mind. He took another small step forward, closing the distance between himself and Richard. Not aggressively, but firmly, making it clear that he wasn't going anywhere, wasn't backing down, wasn't going to let this woman face whatever came next alone. Here's what's going to happen, Cole said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly through the silent roadhouse. You're going to apologize to your wife for hitting her. Then you're going to go home and think real hard about what kind of man you want to be. Richard's laugh was sharp and bitter. Or what, you'll make me? Cole met his eyes steadily. I really hope it doesn't come to that, sir. But if it does, I'm ready. The challenge hung in the air between them like smoke. Everyone in the roadhouse was holding their breath, waiting to see who would blink first. Cole had backed down from plenty of fights in his life when walking away was the smart choice. But this wasn't one of those times. This time, backing down meant leaving a woman to face the consequences of someone else's courage. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Lucy could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears as she watched the two men face each other. Richard, in his expensive suit and shiny shoes, representing everything their small town considered successful and respectable. And this stranger, this cowboy whose name she didn't even know, standing between her and her husband's anger like a shield made of flesh and bone. She'd never seen anyone stand up to Richard before. Not his business partners, not their neighbors, not even his own family. Richard had a way of making people back down, of using his money and influence to get what he wanted. But this stranger didn't seem to care about any of that. I'm waiting, the cowboy said quietly, his voice steady as stone. Richard's face was changing colors like a sunset, going from red to purple to an almost dangerous shade of crimson. Lucy had seen him angry before many times, but this was different. This was public humiliation on a scale he'd never experienced. Everyone in the roadhouse was watching him, judging him, seeing him for what he really was. "You want an apology?" Richard laughed, but there was no humor in it. "From me? Do you have any idea who I am?" The cowboy's expression didn't change. "No, sir, I don't, and I don't much care. A man's actions speak louder than his bank account." Lucy saw Mrs. Peterson nod approvingly from her table. The older woman had known Lucy since she was a child, had watched her grow up and get married and slowly disappear into herself over the years. How many times had Mrs. Peterson seen the signs and wanted to say something? How many people in this room had suspected but chosen to look the other way? "I own 3 construction companies," Richard said, his voice getting louder. "I employ half the men in this town. I've got connections you couldn't dream of." "Good for you," the cowboy replied calmly. "Doesn't give you the right to hit your wife." Tom Bradley, who was still sitting at their table looking extremely uncomfortable, cleared his throat. "Richard, maybe we should all just calm down here. No need for this to get out of hand." But Richard was past the point of calm. Lucy could see the calculation in his eyes, the way he was weighing his options. He couldn't back down now, not in front of all these people. His pride wouldn't let him. But he also couldn't quite bring himself to start a physical fight with a man who looked like he'd spent his life doing hard work with his hands. "You think you're some kind of hero?" Richard asked, taking a step closer to the cowboy. "Riding in here to save the damsel in distress?" "I think I'm a man who knows right from wrong," the cowboy replied. "And I think your wife deserves better than what you just did to her." Lucy felt tears welling up in her eyes again, but this time they weren't from shame. This stranger was talking about her like she mattered, like she was worth protecting. When was the last time anyone had done that? Richard seemed to notice the shift in the room's energy. People were looking at him with disgust now, whispering to each other behind their hands. His carefully constructed image as the successful businessman and pillar of the community was cracking apart like ice in spring. "This is ridiculous," Richard said, trying to regain control of the situation. "Lucy, we're leaving now." He reached for her arm, the same arm he'd grabbed 1,000 times before when he wanted to drag her away from situations he couldn't control. But before his fingers could close around her wrist, the cowboy's hand shot out and caught Richard's wrist in what looked like an iron grip. "I don't think so," the cowboy said quietly. The roadhouse went completely silent. Even the jukebox seemed to hold its breath. Lucy stared at the cowboy's weathered hand wrapped around her husband's wrist, amazed at how easily he'd stopped Richard's movement. Richard was trying to pull free, but the cowboy's grip didn't budge. "Let go of me," Richard said, his voice tight with pain and fury. "Soon as you step back and give the lady some space," the cowboy replied calmly. Lucy could see the confusion and fear starting to creep into Richard's eyes. He was used to being the one who controlled situations through intimidation. He'd never been on the receiving end of it before. "You're making a big mistake, cowboy," Richard said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into." The cowboy's grip on Richard's wrist tightened slightly. "I'm not getting into anything. I'm stopping something. There's a difference." Behind them, Lucy could hear Murphy himself moving closer, probably trying to figure out whether he needed to call the sheriff. Other patrons were pulling out their phones, some probably calling for help, others likely recording what was happening. This would be all over town by morning, if not sooner. "Richard, please," Lucy said quietly, finding her voice for the first time since this whole thing started. "Let's just go home." But even as she said it, she realized she didn't want to go home with him. Not tonight, maybe not ever. The spell had been broken somehow. This stranger had shown her that Richard wasn't all-powerful, wasn't untouchable. He was just a man and not a very good one. "Listen to your wife," the cowboy said, still holding Richard's wrist. "She's got more sense than you do." That seemed to break something inside Richard. Being told that his wife was smarter than him in front of all these people by some nobody cowboy was apparently the final straw. He tried to jerk his hand free again, and when that didn't work, he swung his other fist toward the cowboy's face. The punch was wild and uncoordinated, fueled more by rage and alcohol than any real fighting skill. The cowboy saw it coming from a mile away and simply stepped to the side, letting Richard's momentum carry him forward. Richard stumbled, nearly falling, and the cowboy released his wrist to let him catch his balance. "Easy there," the cowboy said, like he was talking to a spooked horse. No need for anyone to get hurt. But Richard was beyond reason now. His public humiliation was complete, his reputation in ruins, and his wife had just witnessed him being outmaneuvered by a stranger. His face was twisted with rage and embarrassment, and Lucy could see him gathering himself for another attack. "Richard, don't," she said, standing up from her chair. "Please, just stop." For a moment, Richard looked at her, and Lucy saw something flicker in his eyes. Maybe regret, maybe just surprise that she was speaking up at all. But then his pride reasserted itself, and he turned back to the cowboy with renewed fury. "This isn't over," Richard said, pointing a shaking finger at the stranger. "You have no idea who you're messing with." The cowboy just shook his head sadly. "I know exactly who I'm messing with. The question is, do you?" It was such a simple question, but it seemed to hit Richard like a physical blow. For the first time since this whole confrontation started, he looked uncertain, like maybe he was starting to realize that his usual tactics weren't working, that his money and connections meant nothing to this man. "I could have you arrested," Richard said, but his voice lacked conviction. "For what?" the cowboy asked. "Stopping you from grabbing your wife after you hit her? I think most folks would call that the right thing to do." Lucy looked around the room and saw heads nodding in agreement. Even Tom Bradley, who worked with Richard and probably depended on his business, was looking at her husband with obvious disapproval. Richard seemed to realize he was fighting a losing battle. The room was against him, his wife was no longer cowering, and this cowboy wasn't backing down. All his usual weapons, money, influence, intimidation, were useless here. "Fine," Richard said finally, straightening his tie and trying to salvage what was left of his dignity. "But this isn't over. Not by a long shot." He turned toward Lucy, and for a moment she thought he was going to try to force her to leave with him again. But something in the cowboy's posture, the way he subtly positioned himself between them, seemed to change Richard's mind. "Lucy," Richard said, his voice cold and controlled, "when you're done making a fool of yourself, you know where to find me." With that, he turned and walked toward the door, his back straight and his head high, trying to pretend this had been his choice all along. But everyone in the roadhouse could see the truth. Richard had been beaten not by fists but by something much more powerful. He'd been beaten by a man who simply refused to let him get away with being a bully. As the door swung shut behind her husband, Lucy realized she was shaking. Not from fear this time, but from something else entirely. Relief maybe, or just the simple amazement that someone had finally stood up for her. She looked at the cowboy, this stranger, who had turned her world upside down in the space of 10 minutes, and realized she didn't even know his name. "Thank you," she said quietly, the words feeling inadequate for what he'd done. The cowboy tipped his hat slightly. "No thanks needed, ma'am. Just glad I could help." But Lucy knew it was more than help. It was hope. For the first time in years, she had hope that things could be different. The door of Murphy's Roadhouse swung shut behind Richard with a finality that seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet room. For a moment, nobody moved or spoke. Lucy stood frozen beside her chair, one hand still pressed to her cheek where the red mark of Richard's slap was beginning to fade. The cowboy remained where he was, calm and alert, as if he was used to situations like this. Then Murphy himself broke the silence, clearing his throat as he approached their table with a dish towel still in his hands. "Ma'am," he said gently to Lucy, "are you all right? Can I get you some ice for that cheek?" Lucy touched her face self-consciously, suddenly aware that everyone was looking at her. Not with the pity she'd expected, but with something warmer. Concern. Support. When was the last time anyone had looked at her like that? I'm fine," she said automatically, the response that had become second nature over the years. The cowboy turned slightly toward her, his expression gentle but knowing. "With respect, ma'am, you don't look fine, and there's no shame in admitting when you're not." Something about the way he said it, without judgment or pressure, made Lucy's carefully maintained composure start to crack. She'd spent so many years pretending everything was perfect, smiling through the pain, making excuses for Richard's behavior. But this stranger's simple honesty was like a key turning in a lock she'd forgotten existed. "I don't know what I am," she admitted quietly, and felt something loosen in her chest as she said it. Mrs. Peterson stood up from her table and walked over, her face full of maternal concern. "Lucy, honey, why don't you come sit with Harold and me for a bit? You don't need to be alone right now." Lucy looked at the older woman with surprise. Mrs. Peterson had been her neighbor for years, but they'd never been close. Richard didn't like Lucy getting too friendly with the neighbors, said it led to gossip and interference. "That's very kind," Lucy said, "but I should probably go home. Annie's with the babysitter and Richard will be expecting—" She trailed off as she realized what she was saying. Even now, even after what had just happened, her first instinct was to worry about what Richard would want, what Richard would expect. It was such a deeply ingrained habit that she'd almost fallen back into it without thinking. The cowboy must have seen the conflict playing out on her face. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me saying so, what your husband expects might not be the most important thing right now. What do you want?" What did she want? Lucy couldn't remember the last time anyone had asked her that question. What did she want? She wanted to hug her daughter without worrying about whether it would set Richard off. She wanted to read a book without being criticized for wasting time. She wanted to go to sleep at night without listening for footsteps in the hallway, without wondering if tonight would be one of the bad nights. But saying any of that out loud felt impossible. She'd kept those wants buried so deep for so long that admitting to them felt like betraying everything she'd built her life around. "I want Annie to be safe," she said finally, because that was the one thing she could admit without feeling guilty. "Then maybe going home to an angry man isn't the best choice tonight," Mrs. Peterson said gently. "Harold and I have that spare room since our kids moved out. You and Annie could stay with us until you figure things out." Lucy stared at her in amazement. "You'd do that for me?" "Honey, half this town has been worried about you for years," Mrs. Peterson said. "We've all seen the signs, but nobody knew how to help. Richard's got a lot of influence around here and people were afraid to get involved. But not anymore," said a voice from another table. Lucy turned to see Jerry Martinez, who owned the hardware store downtown. "What happened here tonight?" "Well, let's just say Richard's reputation took a pretty big hit." Other people were nodding, murmuring agreement. Lucy realized that her private nightmare hadn't been as private as she'd thought. People had known, or at least suspected, but they'd felt powerless to do anything about it. The cowboy, who had been listening quietly to this exchange, spoke up. "Ma'am, I don't know you or your situation, but I know what I saw tonight. And I've seen enough situations like this to know that going home to an angry man rarely ends well for anyone." His words carried the weight of experience, and Lucy found herself really looking at him for the first time. He had kind eyes, but there was something sad in them too, like he'd seen too much pain in his life, maybe even caused some of it himself. "How do I know you're not just making things worse?" Lucy asked, not accusingly but genuinely curious. "Richard's right about one thing. You don't know our situation. What if this just makes him angrier? What if he takes it out on Annie?" It was the cowboy's turn to look conflicted. He ran a hand through his hair, pushing his hat back slightly. "You're right to be concerned about that, ma'am. I can't promise that standing up to him won't have consequences, but I can tell you that bullies like your husband don't usually get better on their own. They get worse." Murphy, who had been hovering nearby with obvious concern, stepped forward. "Lucy, I've been in this business for 20 years and I've seen a lot of things I wish I hadn't. But I've never seen a man hit his wife in my establishment. I want you to know that Richard isn't welcome here anymore. Not until he gets some help and makes some serious changes." Lucy felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. Murphy's Roadhouse was one of the social centers of their small town. Being banned from here was more than just losing a place to drink. It was a public statement about what the community thought of Richard's behavior. "But he'll blame me for that," Lucy said quietly. "He'll say it's my fault for embarrassing him." "That's what abusers do," said a new voice. Lucy turned to see Dr. Martinez, Jerry's wife, approaching their group. As the town's only family counselor, she'd probably seen her share of situations like this. They make their victims feel responsible for the consequences of their own actions. Dr. Martinez continued gently. "But Lucy, what happened tonight wasn't your fault. You didn't make Richard hit you. You didn't make him choose violence over conversation. Those were his choices, and now he has to live with the results." Lucy felt tears starting to well up again. But these were different from the tears of shame and pain she'd cried earlier. These felt cleaner somehow, like they were washing away years of accumulated guilt and self-doubt. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "I don't know how to be on my own, how to take care of Annie by myself. Richard handles all the money, all the important decisions. I don't even know what our bank account looks like." The cowboy stepped closer, his voice gentle but firm. "Ma'am, I don't mean to overstep, but you've been taking care of Annie just fine all these years. You've been taking care of everything, from what I can see. You just haven't been getting credit for it." Mrs. Peterson nodded emphatically. "He's right, honey. You think we don't see how hard you work? How you volunteer at Annie's school? Help with the church fundraisers, keep that big house of yours running like clockwork. You're stronger than you know." Lucy wanted to believe them, but the voice in her head, the voice that sounded suspiciously like Richard's, kept telling her they were wrong. That she was weak, helpless, dependent, that she'd never make it on her own. "What about work?" she asked. "I haven't had a job in 8 years. Who's going to hire me?" "The elementary school's been looking for a substitute teacher," Dr. Martinez said. "You've got a college degree, right? And all that volunteer work shows you're good with kids. And there's Tom Chen who runs the bookkeeping service," added Jerry Martinez. "He's always complaining about being swamped. Basic bookkeeping isn't rocket science. You could learn it." Lucy stared at them all in amazement. In the space of 20 minutes, her neighbors had gone from polite acquaintances to a support network she'd never known existed. Was it really that simple? Had help been available all along if she'd only known how to ask for it? The cowboy seemed to sense her internal struggle. "Ma'am, I know this is a lot to take in all at once. Nobody's saying you have to make any big decisions tonight. But maybe just for tonight you could stay somewhere safe while you think things through." Lucy thought about going home to the big house on Maple Street, facing Richard's anger and disappointment. She thought about explaining to Annie why Daddy was upset, about lying awake all night wondering if this was the time things would get really bad. Then she thought about Mrs. Peterson's spare room, about having a peaceful night's sleep, about morning coffee with people who actually seemed to care about her well-being. "Okay," she said quietly, surprised by her own voice. "Just for tonight." Mrs. Peterson beamed like Lucy had just given her a gift. "I'll call Harold and have him get the room ready. Do you want to stop by your house and get some things for you and Annie?" Lucy's stomach clenched at the thought of facing Richard so soon. "I don't know if that's a good idea. He'll be angry, and if Annie sees us fighting—" The cowboy spoke up quietly. "I could go with you if you want. Just to make sure everything stays calm." Lucy looked at him in surprise. "You'd do that? You don't even know me." He shrugged like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Sometimes people need help, and sometimes you're in a position to give it. Seems pretty straightforward to me." For the first time all evening, Lucy felt herself smile. It was a small smile, tentative and uncertain, but it was real. 3 months had passed since that night at Murphy's Roadhouse, and Lucy Thompson was still amazed at how different her life looked now. She stood in the doorway of her small apartment above the bookstore on Main Street, watching Annie play in the tiny backyard with the neighbor's cat. The apartment was a fraction of the size of the house on Maple Street, but it felt bigger somehow. Freer. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window as Lucy made coffee in the quiet that had become her favorite part of each day. No angry footsteps overhead, no tense silence waiting to be broken by criticism or demands. Just peace. And the sound of her daughter's laughter from outside. She'd kept her promise to stay at Mrs. Peterson's for just one night, but that one night had stretched into a week as the reality of her situation became clear. Richard had been furious, of course. He'd called Mrs. Peterson's house repeatedly, demanding that Lucy come home immediately. When that didn't work, he'd shown up at the door, alternating between threats and promises to change. But something had shifted in Lucy that night at the Roadhouse. The spell was broken and she couldn't unsee what she'd seen. With the support of her neighbors and the gentle encouragement of Dr. Martinez, she'd found the courage to file for divorce and obtain a restraining order. The legal process had been terrifying at first. Richard had hired an expensive lawyer from the state capitol, someone who specialized in making problems disappear for wealthy clients. But the story of what happened at Murphy's had spread through town, and several people had volunteered to testify about what they'd witnessed that night. More importantly, other women had come forward. Quietly, carefully, they'd shared their own stories about Richard's behavior. A secretary who'd quit his company after he'd cornered her in his office. A waitress at the country club who'd endured months of inappropriate comments. The pattern was clear, and the judge had taken it seriously. Lucy was still learning how to manage money, how to pay bills, how to make decisions without asking permission first. The substitute teaching job at the elementary school had led to a full-time position when one of the regular teachers decided to retire early. It wasn't a lot of money, but it was hers, earned by her own effort and skill. The bookkeeping classes had been harder than she'd expected, but Tom Chen had been patient with her mistakes and encouraging about her progress. She was good with numbers, it turned out, better than she'd ever known, since Richard had never let her near their finances. Annie had struggled with the changes at first. She missed the big house, missed having her own room, missed the expensive toys that Richard had used to show his affection. But children were resilient, and Lucy was amazed at how quickly Annie had adapted to their new life. "Mommy, can I have a snack?" Annie called from the backyard, her face flushed from playing in the sun. "Of course, sweetheart," Lucy called back. "Wash your hands first." These simple interactions still felt precious to Lucy. No one was monitoring what she fed her daughter, criticizing her parenting choices, or undermining her authority. She was just a mother taking care of her child, and it felt revolutionary. A knock at the front door interrupted her thoughts. Lucy wiped her hands on a dish towel and went to answer it, checking through the peephole first. It was a habit she'd developed since leaving Richard, though he'd been surprisingly quiet since the divorce was finalized. His lawyer had probably advised him that any contact with Lucy or Annie would violate the restraining order and could land him in jail. Through the peephole, she saw a familiar figure in a cowboy hat. Cole Barrett stood on her doorstep, holding what looked like a small toolbox. Lucy opened the door with a smile. "Cole, what a nice surprise. What brings you by?" He tipped his hat, the gesture that had become endearingly familiar over the past few months. "Morning, Lucy. I was talking to Tom Chen yesterday and he mentioned your kitchen faucet's been giving you trouble. Thought I might take a look at it if you don't mind." Lucy felt the familiar warmth that Cole's thoughtfulness always brought. He'd become a fixture in their small community since that night at Murphy's, taking a permanent job at the Miller Ranch instead of moving on like he'd originally planned. He'd never said why he'd decided to stay, but Lucy had her suspicions. "You don't have to do that," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "I can call a plumber." "I know you can," Cole said with a slight smile. "But plumbers are expensive, and fixing a dripping faucet is pretty simple work. Besides, I like staying busy on my days off." Annie came running in from the backyard, her face lighting up when she saw Cole. "Mr. Barrett, did you come to fix something again?" Cole knelt down to her level, his expression serious. "I did indeed, Miss Annie. Your mom mentioned the kitchen faucet was being stubborn, and we can't have that, can we?" Annie giggled and shook her head vigorously. She'd taken to Cole immediately, drawn to his gentle manner and the way he treated her like an important person rather than just a child to be managed. As Cole worked on the faucet, Lucy made fresh coffee and tried not to think too hard about how natural this felt. How right it seemed to have him in her kitchen, discussing Annie's school project while he tightened connections and replaced washers. Over the past few months, Cole had become part of their routine in small but meaningful ways. He'd shown up to help Lucy move into the apartment, refusing any payment but accepting a home-cooked meal as thanks. He taught Annie how to identify different birds at the park, sharing his knowledge of wildlife from years of outdoor work. He'd been there when Lucy's car broke down, when Annie got sick with the flu, when Lucy had panic attacks about court dates and custody hearings. But he'd never pushed for more than friendship, never made her feel pressured or uncomfortable. He seemed to understand that she needed time to figure out who she was outside of marriage, outside of being Richard's wife. "There," Cole said, wiping his hands on a rag as he tested the faucet. "Should be good as new now. How much do I owe you?" Lucy asked, reaching for her purse. Cole held up a hand, looking mildly offended. "Lucy, we've been through this. Friends help friends. No charge." "But you spent your whole morning here," Lucy protested. "And you had to buy parts." "Cost me $3 in washers and about an hour of my time," Cole said. "I think I can afford to help out a friend." Lucy felt that familiar flutter in her chest that Cole's presence always brought. She was attracted to him, had been almost from the beginning, but the idea of dating anyone still felt overwhelming. She was just learning how to be independent, how to make her own decisions. Was she ready to risk that hard-won freedom for romance? As if sensing her thoughts, Cole gathered up his tools and headed toward the door. "I should let you and Annie get on with your Saturday." "But Lucy—" He paused at the door, his expression uncertain for the first time since she'd known him. "Yes?" Lucy prompted gently. "There's a community dance next weekend. Nothing fancy, just the church fundraiser at the community center. I was wondering if you might like to go. With me, I mean. Lucy felt her heart speed up. She'd been to those dances before, back when she was younger, before Richard. They were sweet, old-fashioned affairs with live music and homemade punch, where families came together to socialize and raise money for good causes. Lucy started, then stopped. What was she afraid of? That people would talk? They were already talking, had been since the night at Murphy's. That Richard would disapprove? Richard's approval was no longer her concern. I'd like that, she said quietly, surprised by her own boldness. Cole's face lit up with a smile that transformed his whole expression. Really, that's wonderful. I could pick you and Annie up around 7 if that works. Annie too? Lucy asked, touched that he'd automatically included her daughter. Of course, Cole said, looking puzzled that she'd even ask. Wouldn't be the same without her. After Cole left, Lucy sat at her kitchen table with a fresh cup of coffee, watching Annie draw pictures at the other end of the table. The apartment was quiet except for the scratch of crayons on paper and the steady tick of the clock on the wall. She thought about the woman she'd been 3 months ago, afraid to speak up for herself, afraid to want anything beyond what she was given. That woman would never have believed she could be sitting here now in her own place, making her own decisions, raising her daughter in peace. The road to healing hadn't been straight or easy. There had been nights when she'd cried herself to sleep, overwhelmed by the responsibility of supporting herself and Annie. There had been moments of doubt when Richard's voice in her head told her she was making a terrible mistake, that she'd never make it on her own. But there had also been moments of pure joy that she'd never experienced in her marriage. The first time she'd bought groceries without worrying about someone criticizing her choices. The morning she'd woken up and realized she'd slept through the night without fear. The day Annie had told her teacher that her mommy was the bravest person she knew. Dr. Martinez had told her that healing wasn't linear, that there would be good days and bad days, progress and setbacks. But Lucy was learning to trust herself, to believe in her own strength and judgment. She was learning that she deserved kindness, respect and love, and maybe, just maybe, she was ready to let someone show her what healthy love looked like. Mommy, Annie said, looking up from her drawing.